At the Thanksgiving celebration, my sister's fiancé insulted our family, and he did it with a smile so calm it took a second to register the damage. We were barely seated. The turkey was still steaming. My mom was mid-sentence about how long she'd basted it when Nathan leaned back, glanced around the table, and said, "I guess not everyone grows up with refined traditions." Silence crashed down harder than any slammed door. My dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My grandmother's hand tightened around her napkin. And my sister, laughed softly, like he just told a clever joke instead of cutting us open in front of everyone. I felt my chest heat up, that sharp mix of disbelief and anger that makes your ears ring. That was the moment I knew this Thanksgiving wasn't about gratitude anymore. It was about respect. And before the night was over, someone was going to lose it. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday because it was the one day a year my family really tried to pretend everything was perfect.
No losing. No excuses.
Just food, noise, and people talking over each other in our dining room like we always did. This year was supposed to be special. Rachel was engaged. She'd brought Nathan home for Thanksgiving as her fiancé, not just her boyfriend anymore, and she'd spent weeks talking him up like he was some kind of rare prize. Intelligent. Sophisticated. Different from anyone I've ever dated, she'd said more than once, her eyes shining every time she said his name. I wanted to be happy for her. I really did. But from the moment Nathan walked through the door, something felt off. He was polite in that overly rehearsed way, shaking hands a second too long, smiling without warmth. He complimented our house like it was a museum exhibit, charming, simple, cozy, words that sounded nice, but somehow landed wrong. Rachel didn't notice. Or maybe she didn't want to. She hovered near him, laughing at everything he said, touching his arm like she needed to remind herself he was real. I caught my mom watching them from the kitchen, that careful smile on her face she used when she was trying not to judge too fast. Dinner took forever to get on the table. My dad insisted on carving the turkey himself like he did every year, and my grandmother kept shooing everyone away from the rolls because they were finally just right. It was loud and familiar and comforting, at least it should have been. Nathan sat at the head of the table beside Rachel, straight-backed, surveying everything like a guest who'd already decided he wouldn't be impressed. I noticed how his eyes lingered on the chipped plates we'd had since I was a kid, how he raised his eyebrows slightly at the mismatched chairs. When we finally sat down, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being protective, territorial. Rachel deserved happiness, and maybe Nathan was just nervous. I took a breath, passed the gravy, and tried to relax. That's when he lifted his glass, glanced around at all of us, my parents, my grandmother, my cousins, and said his first comment. Not loud, not aggressive, just sharp enough to change the air in the room forever. And as everyone froze, I realized this wasn't going to be a normal family dinner. It was the beginning of something ugly. Nathan didn't raise his voice. That was the worst part. He spoke like someone offering casual observations, the kind you're supposed to nod along to so you don't look unsophisticated. He took a bite of turkey, chewed slowly, then tilted his head. "It's fine," he said. "A little dry, though. My family usually brines for days. Texture matters when you're used to real cooking." My mom blinked, clearly unsure whether she'd heard him right. "Oh," she said lightly. "Well, we've always made it this way." Nathan smiled. "Of course. Traditions are hard to break." I felt my jaw tighten. Rachel laughed again, quick and eager, like she was smoothing over a wrinkle in expensive fabric. "He's just really into food," she said. "You know how passionate he is." Nathan moved on to the mashed potatoes next. He scooped a small amount onto his plate, barely touched it, then leaned toward Rachel. He didn't whisper, he didn't have to. "Instant potatoes?" he asked. "Interesting choice." "They're homemade," my dad said, his voice calm but firmer than before. "Oh," Nathan replied, eyebrows lifting. "I guess I'm just used to a different standard. Where I come from, food is art." The word art hung in the air, like an accusation. My grandmother set her fork down. She'd been quiet so far, watching him with the same expression she used when she was deciding whether someone was worth her energy. Nathan didn't notice. He reached for a roll, tore it in half, and frowned. "No crust," he said. "Real bread has a bite to it." I looked around the table. My uncle stared at his plate. My cousin pretended to be fascinated by the centerpiece. No one said anything, and that silence felt like permission. Nathan kept going. He commented on how small our dining room was. How cozy neighborhoods like ours were, nice for raising kids, I guess. How not everyone valued ambition the same way. Each remark was wrapped in politeness, but the message underneath was clear. Less than. When my mom brought out my grandmother's pumpkin pie, the same recipe she'd been making for 40 years, Nathan took one bite and nodded thoughtfully.
"Sweet," he said.
"Very American." Something in my chest snapped tight. Rachel leaned into him, smiling, her hand resting on his knee like an anchor. "You're being so honest tonight," she said, like it was a compliment. That's when I realized she wasn't just ignoring what he was doing. She was proud of him. I watched my family absorb each comment, watched them shrink in their seats without meaning to, and I felt heat crawl up my neck. This wasn't teasing. It wasn't awkward nerves. It was disrespect, served calmly, deliberately, course after course. And if no one else was going to say something, I knew I wouldn't be able to stay quiet much longer. By the time we reached the middle of the meal, Nathan had stopped pretending he was just making observations. His comments sharpened, each one landing a little deeper than the last, like he was testing how much he could get away with. He asked my dad what he did for work, then nodded slowly as if evaluating a disappointing resume. "Stable," Nathan said. "There's something comforting about jobs like that. Not everyone needs to push themselves." My dad smiled, tight and controlled. "I've pushed myself plenty." "I'm sure," Nathan replied, glancing around the table. "It's just different priorities."
Different. Inferior.
He turned to my cousin Jason next, asking where he'd gone to school. When Jason told him it was a state university, Nathan chuckled softly. "College is really what you make of it," he said. "Some environments just don't challenge you." Jason flushed but didn't respond. Rachel watched all of this with a strange expression, half admiration, half nerves. Every time Nathan spoke, she leaned closer to him, like she was afraid that if she didn't stay perfectly aligned, she'd end up on the other side of his judgment too. Then he looked at me. "So, Emily," he said, smiling. "What about you?" I felt every eye at the table turn in my direction. "I work in marketing," I said carefully. Nathan nodded, swirling his drink again. "That makes sense. Creative, but accessible." Accessible, like a product on a clearance shelf. I opened my mouth to respond, but my grandmother spoke first. "Emily works very hard," she said, her voice calm but solid. Nathan blinked, surprised, then smiled wider. "Oh, I didn't mean anything negative. I just admire people who are content with simpler paths." That was it. That was the moment politeness officially died. He wasn't just insulting us anymore, he was doing it in a way that made us sound foolish for feeling insulted at all. And the worst part was how confident he was, how comfortable he seemed dismantling my family piece by piece at our own table. When dessert came around, my mom asked if everyone was enjoying themselves, her voice just a little too bright. Nathan laughed softly. "It's been enlightening," he said. "You can really see how upbringing shapes expectations." I felt my hands curl into fists under the table. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and uneven, like a warning. I glanced at Rachel, waiting, hoping for her to step in, to say enough. She didn't. She smiled and squeezed Nathan's hand, as if proud he'd managed to articulate something profound. That's when I stopped seeing him as just my sister's fiancé. I saw him for what he really was, someone who needed to feel superior so badly that he was willing to humiliate strangers' family to get it. I also realized something else, something colder and more unsettling. Nathan wasn't nervous. He wasn't joking. This wasn't a mistake. This was who he was when he thought he had power. And sitting there, watching my family endure it in silence, I knew the tension in the room wasn't going to fade on its own. It was building, stretching tight between us, waiting for anyone to pull hard enough for it to snap. After Nathan's last comment, something shifted inside me. The anger was still there, burning steady, but now it was joined by something sharper, suspicion. When someone talks that much about standards, success, and superiority, it's usually because they're afraid of being exposed as ordinary. I started listening differently. Not to the insults themselves, but to the details wrapped around them. Nathan loved to speak in broad strokes. He talked about elite circles, high expectations, the kind of people he usually spent time with. But every time someone asked a follow-up question, he slid sideways instead of answering straight on. My uncle asked where he'd gone to school. "A private program," Nathan said smoothly. "Very selective." "Which one?" my uncle pressed, smiling like it was casual curiosity. Nathan lifted his glass. "It's not really about the name. It's about the mindset." Rachel laughed, a little too quickly. "You always say that," she told him, like this was a charming quirk. But I noticed how his jaw tightened for just a second. Later, my mom mentioned the neighborhood Rachel and Nathan were planning to move into after the wedding. Nathan waved a hand dismissively. "It's temporary," he said. "Just until something more fitting opens up." Fitting. Another vague word. Another dodge. I watched him closely now, the way he corrected people even when they weren't wrong, the way he redirected conversations back to himself whenever they drifted. He didn't ask questions unless they gave him an excuse to evaluate the answer. He didn't share stories unless they painted him as impressive. And every time Rachel looked at him, it was with the same soft, hopeful expression, like she was clinging to the version of him she'd built in her head. I leaned toward her at one point and whispered, "Are you okay?" She nodded immediately. He's just intense, she whispered back. He means well. I didn't believe that anymore. When my grandmother excused herself from the table, Nathan watched her go and said quietly, older generations struggle with change. They take things personally. Something icy slid down my spine. He wasn't just insulting us, he was already explaining why our reactions wouldn't matter. I realized then that this dinner wasn't about nerves or awkward first impressions. Nathan was drawing lines. He was showing us where he believed he stood and where he believed we belonged. And Rachel was standing on his side of the line, whether she understood that or not. I looked around the table at my parents, at the people who had loved and supported my sister her entire life, and I felt a strange mix of protectiveness and resolve settle into my chest. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew this much. If Nathan kept talking, the truth was going to come out one way or another. Because people who rely this heavily on superiority usually have something they're desperately trying to hide. I didn't plan to confront Nathan. I didn't stand up with a speech prepared or wait for the perfect opening. It happened because he laughed. My mom had just said something small, something harmless, about how she was grateful we could all be together, even if life wasn't perfect. Her voice trembled a little at the word grateful, like she was holding the whole evening together with that one sentence. Nathan let out a soft chuckle. That's a very modest outlook, he said. The word modest hit the table like a dropped plate. I felt it before I thought it. Heat rushed up my neck, my hands flat against my thighs as if I were bracing myself. Modest, I repeated. Nathan turned toward me, surprised but amused. I didn't mean it as an insult. No, I said, my voice shaking just enough to betray how close I was to losing control. You just meant it as a judgment. Rachel's head snapped toward me. Emily. No, I said again louder now. I'm not letting this go. The room went completely silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator felt too loud. Nathan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. I think you're being overly sensitive. That was it. The oldest trick in the book. Sensitive. I laughed, sharp and humorless. You've spent this entire dinner criticizing our food, our jobs, our education, our house, and now our values. So no, this isn't sensitivity. This is me finally responding. My dad cleared his throat. Emily. I've got this, I said, without taking my eyes off Nathan. Rachel stood up halfway from her chair. Why are you attacking him? He didn't mean it that way. I turned to her then, and that hurt more than anything Nathan had said all night. Rachel, I said quietly. He meant it exactly the way it sounded. Nathan smiled, thin and controlled. I'm sorry if honesty makes people uncomfortable. I was raised to value excellence. And where exactly did you learn that? I asked. He blinked. Excuse me? You talk a lot about standards, I continued, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. About ambition. About refinement. But every time someone asks you for specifics, you dodge the question. That's not true, Rachel said quickly. Then answer one. I said, looking back at Nathan. Just one. Where did you go to school? Nathan's jaw tightened. I already told you. A private program. Which one? He exhaled slowly, like I was exhausting him. Why does that matter? Because, I said, my voice steadier now, people who are proud of their achievements don't avoid naming them. The air felt thick, suffocating. My mom whispered my name, but I couldn't stop now. You talk about elite circles, I went on. About people who live up here. I gestured vaguely upward. But you've never once mentioned a concrete detail that can't be waved away. Nathan laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. This is absurd. You're interrogating me like I'm on trial. No, I said. I'm asking you to back up the way you've treated my family. Rachel shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. Why are you doing this to us? I looked at her, really looked at her. Because I love you, I said. And because I won't sit here while the man you're about to marry talks down to everyone who raised you. Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is unbelievable, he said. I come into your home, I try to be honest, and I'm attacked for it. Honest. I shot back. Honesty isn't cruelty dressed up in polite words. He pointed at me, his composure finally cracking. You're jealous. The accusation hung there, ridiculous and desperate. Jealous of what? I asked. Your condescension? Rachel let out a sob. Stop. Both of you, please. Nathan turned to her, his voice softening instantly. You see what I'm dealing with? Something in me snapped completely. No, I said, stepping forward. What we're dealing with? I gestured around the table. You walked in here tonight assuming you were better than us. Smarter. More accomplished. More worthy. And you thought no one would challenge you because you sound confident when you talk. Nathan's face flushed red. I don't have to justify myself to you. You do, I said, my voice ringing through the room. If you want to be part of this family. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer.
Admit something.
Anything. Instead, he scoffed. This family clearly has issues with insecurity. That was when my grandmother spoke. She hadn't said a word all night. She stood slowly, placing both hands on the table. Young man, she said, her voice calm but iron strong. Confidence doesn't require humiliating others. Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it again. My grandmother looked at Rachel. And love, she added gently, doesn't ask you to accept disrespect as the price of being chosen. Rachel collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. The truth settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Nathan wasn't misunderstood. He wasn't refined. He wasn't honest. He was cruel, and he'd finally been seen. As he stood there, breathing hard, eyes darting from face to face, I realized something with startling clarity. This wasn't the end of the dinner. It was the end of the illusion. No one spoke for a long moment after my grandmother's words. The room felt hollow, like all the air had been sucked out at once. Nathan stood there, rigid and flushed, as if he couldn't decide whether to argue or run. Rachel still had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet, uneven breaths. My dad finally pushed his chair back and stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This dinner is over, he said. Not because of Emily. Because of what's been said. Nathan laughed weakly, trying to recover some sense of control. So that's it? One disagreement, and I'm judged. My mom looked at him then, really looked at him, and shook her head. This wasn't one comment, she said softly. It was all of them. That seemed to hit harder than anything else. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it, then turned to Rachel. You're not seriously going to let this happen, he said, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. Rachel lifted her head slowly. Her eyes were red, her makeup smudged, but there was something different there now. Clarity, maybe. Or exhaustion. I don't know what to let happen, she said. I don't even recognize what just happened. Nathan took a step toward her. They're twisting everything I said. No, she replied, standing up. They're repeating it. That was when he went quiet. Completely quiet. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and muttered something about needing air. The front door closed behind him a few seconds later, harder than necessary. The sound echoed through the house, final and ugly. Rachel sank back into her chair like her bones had suddenly turned to water. I moved toward her instinctively, but she shook her head. I just need a minute, she whispered. We gave her space. No one rushed to clean up the table. Plates sat half-finished. The turkey cooled. It felt wrong to pretend we could just move on to dessert after what had happened. A few minutes later, Rachel stood again, steadier this time. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely holding. I didn't see it. Or maybe I didn't want to. My mom crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her without a word. Rachel broke then, crying openly into her shoulder, and I felt the tight knot in my chest finally loosen, just a little. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel relieved. I felt tired. Because confronting Nathan hadn't fixed everything. It hadn't magically repaired my sister's heart or erased the things that had been said. But as I looked around at my family, quiet, shaken, still together, I knew one thing for sure. The truth had been spoken. And even though it hurt, it had stopped the damage from going any further. Nathan didn't come back that night. He texted Rachel once, something short and defensive about needing space and how things had been taken out of context. She didn't reply. She just stared at her phone for a long time, then turned it face down on the table like she was afraid it might bite her. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, fragile quiet. We packed leftovers into containers no one seemed excited to take home. My dad wrapped the turkey with careful precision, like routine might hold us together. My grandmother rinsed dishes even though no one asked her to, her movements slow and deliberate. Rachel stayed. That alone told me more than any dramatic declaration could have. Later, when everyone else had drifted off to different rooms, she and I sat on the edge of my bed, knees touching. She looked smaller somehow, like the certainty she'd been wearing for months had finally cracked and slipped off. I feel so stupid, she said. I defended him. I let him talk like that. You wanted to believe in the future you imagined, I said quietly. She nodded, tears pooling again. I don't know what happens now. I didn't give her advice. I didn't tell her what to do. I just stayed there listening because whatever came next had to be her choice, not something she was pushed into by shame or anger. The next morning, Nathan sent another message. Longer this time. An apology wrapped in explanations. Stress. Misunderstandings. Different communication styles. Rachel read it once. Then she deleted it. She didn't say anything out loud, but when she looked at me, there was a firmness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Some things don't end with slammed doors or dramatic goodbyes. Sometimes they end quietly, with the decision not to go back. Thanksgiving didn't end the way it usually did. There was no shared laughter over pie, no lazy arguments about football, no sense of comfortable completion. Instead, it left us with something quieter and heavier. In the weeks that followed, Rachel didn't rush into decisions. She took space. She asked herself hard questions. And slowly, I watched her come back to herself. Not the version of her that wanted to impress someone, but the one who used to laugh too loud and defend people she loved without hesitation. Nathan became a story we referenced less and less, until eventually he was just a lesson folded into the past. Not a villain, not a tragedy, just proof of what happens when charm replaces kindness and confidence masks contempt. As for me, I learned something I didn't expect. Standing up that night didn't make me brave. It made me honest. And honesty, I realized, is the real risk. Because once you speak the truth, you can't pretend you didn't see what you saw. Our family wasn't perfect before that dinner. We weren't refined or impressive or elite. But we were real. And when everything else fell apart at that table, reality was the one thing that held.